I'm really excited to get to do this on the same day that we're opening the Epicenter and that we're cutting the ribbons officially to launch this. And in particular, because Elder Anderson started us off with a prayer of saying that he prays that this would be a place of peace and conversation. And we're kicking it off. We're embodying the conversations right now. David and I are going to have a quick conversation about the industry. And I'm so glad for it. This is our very first public event at the Epicenter. So David, thank you for being here for it. Thank you for inaugurating our public events here. And I hope that this is the beginning of a lot of opportunities where we'll get to sit in this space and use this as a platform for talking about the industry and talking about the ways that we want to see the world change. Today, folks, we have with us, you already know him, but I'm going to brag about him for a few moments by talking about the amazing accomplishments that David has had. One of the most prominent journalists and thought leaders in our field. David Bank is the founder, editor, and CEO of Impact Alpha, the leading publication in our industry, and something I think I can say confidently, all of us here read very regularly, at least the headlines. Under David's leadership, Impact Alpha really has become a must-read for folks in the industry since he founded the company, was it 13, 14 years ago now-ish?
ImpactAlpha.com we had our 10th anniversary last year.
10th anniversary.
So 11 now, I suppose.
Okay, was it print before that?
No, never.
Oh, fantastic, 10 years ago. David is former staff reporter at the Wall Street Journal. He covered e-commerce, cybersecurity, corporate IT, including Microsoft's rise and eventual stumble in the face of the antitrust scrutiny. David established the journal's philanthropy beat. I did not know that. That's exciting. And pioneered coverage of social impact investing while at the Wall Street Journal. Prior to that, David was at the San Jose News, Newsweek, and the LA Daily News. Lots of you said that like
San Jose Mercury News.
Oh, San Jose Mercury News. Sorry.
They would correct you.
Sorry. Yes, I've been corrected. And authored the book Breaking Windows.
About Microsoft.
Yes, about Microsoft. I assumed. David, as we kick this off, for the benefit of anybody who's here and the industry is not as familiar to them, could you define the term impact investing for us?
If you're at the Institute, this is a test from Katie. First of all, just thank you so much for inviting me. This has been a wonderful couple days and getting to know all of you. And we've had a great relationship with the Sorenson, all the different parts, the Institute, the foundation, and SOCAP, and Robert, and everybody has been terrific partners over time. So thank you for all that and for inviting me out here. Yeah, I think the GIN definition of impact investing is investing for measurable, positive, social and environmental impact, as well as financial returns. My good friend Mark over there said it's essentially some version of doing well by doing good, and doing good and making money. The only reason I sort of hesitate is, while we've kind of planted our flag in impact investing, we kind of have a broader vision or mandate for ourselves, which is much more around sort of transformation of global finance, getting all the resources and all the talent and rowing in the direction of optimizing for a better world and for people and planet. And impact investing, I think, is one and a major kind of way to do that, but there's obviously other parts of it as well. So impact investing at its kind of smallest circle can be just another form of wealth management. Transformation of global finance is obviously has to bring in a lot more players, a lot more stakeholders.
There's some systems that need to change to have that happen. That really resonates with me. At the Institute, we have as a vision to make impact investing go away, and I think that really resonates with how you guys think about it at Impact Alpha. We don't want to see the impact investing industry stay niche, stay small, stay carefully defined. But instead, we want to see that every dollar that's allocated across the world, regardless of who's allocating it, it's being allocated through a lens of impact and through a lens of recognizing that we're creating the world. I say this over and over again, we're creating the world we have to live in. We might as well create the world we want to live in, right, as we allocate dollars. That super resonates with me. David, I think one of the most unusual parts of your background is that you started off as a journalist and you became an entrepreneur. Not all journalists have it in them to be entrepreneurs?
Well, there's actually a kind of truism in the industry that that media publications run by journalists as entrepreneurs tend not to like. And I was at the Wall Street.
This is a bad idea, is what you're telling me.
I was at the Wall Street Journal in the pre-Rupert Murdoch days, and that was where that truism sort of developed. But I'm kind of an accidental entrepreneur because I think most entrepreneurs are like, what's the biggest business opportunity I could go tackle or something? And I didn't start there. We started actually as a editorial journalistic, I sort of assigned myself to the beat. And I've been sort of in my journalism career kind of a proud like beat reporter, the feature reporters who kind of drop in and get the sort of, fluffy cover stories were one thing, and then there were us kind of working hacks as we called ourselves, and it became apparent through SOCAP and other kind of conversations that there was nobody working this beat really, and I like super interesting.
Yeah.
Super. Like the best beat, and also some money behind it.
There's a real opportunity.
So follow the money.
Right. Yeah.
And we started like thinking like, okay, there was a lot of folks at the time, and this is 10 or 12 years ago, as you say, were like, oh, we have these great ideas if we could only get financed, and blah, blah, blah. And so we're like, well, let's go from the other side and say like, where's the smart money going, and what are the big trends, and what are the drivers that the world is going to kind of arrive at, and if we can get there slightly before the rest of the world, will be a interesting company. So we just started covering it.
Yeah.
And at first it was sort of just me, and then we started having a kind of team of reporters, and we cycled through a number of different business models. But we about now 6 years ago, I think 2018, launched our subscription business.
Okay.
Which is hard slogging, and we have built it over time, and so now we are have a annual recurring revenues, which
amazing,
which folks like.
Yeah, that's a huge hurdle.
And we have built a media platform, and we have growth plans, and we raised some money, including from the Sorenson Foundation, at the end of 2023. So we're a venture-funded media company, and I suppose I am an entrepreneur, but I really came at it from an editorial journalistic lens.
Right. But you're really eating the dog food, as people say, right? You're writing about it, but you're doing it, right? You had to raise money from impact investors and find a business model and figure out how to return to your investors the two things they want: impact and returns.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. And we have a terrific set of investors who are in it for all of that, and we think that there's, our maybe could be hyperbole, maybe not, was that all business media, all business for starters, to your point, and then by extension all business media will have to come around to this, and you can kind of see it. We at the early days, and it hasn't changed as much as I thought. In the early days, you could get, the New York Times would once a year do some story, right? Yep. And it would be sort of a pat on the head. Isn't it cute that these, that these do-gooders want, and it was always the same story, and you could read it year after year, and it was sort of always the same.
Yeah.
And we're like, no, it's a beat, it's a organism. There's dynamics, there's growth, there's disagreements, and in the impact investing world, there's a thing grows up, and then everybody like cuts it down, and then another thing grows up, and from a journalism point, that's terrific if you kind of get a story on the way up, and then you get a story on the way down. And
mirroring your little Microsoft coverage, perhaps.
So where was I going with this?
I was just saying you're eating the dog food. You have to return both impact and returns, financial returns to your investors. Yeah.
And a lot of people said, oh, you sound more like a nonprofit or something. And there's lots of nonprofit news organizations.
Yeah.
It's been sort of a way to sort of fill some of the gaps in the collapse of the newspaper industry and stuff. But we had that point actually, which is no, if we're going to be covering impact investing, we should be actually living it ourselves and developing a model and finding a way to make a go of it and being able to bring in investment and then also be able to scale. Oh, that was where I was going. That all business media will come around to impact and sustainability themes, and you can see that over the course of the years. That it's not some marginal part of the economy anymore. It's housing, food, healthcare. And essentially now these are the themes that are going to drive business.
Yeah, it's the real stuff of everyday life. It's the real solutions. Yeah, that makes sense. And you've touched on this a little bit now, talking about different media companies and how they're covering things, but I'm curious to hear from you. In your view, what role do you think media and journalism play in shaping the impact investing ecosystem? And obviously this could be applied to other ecosystems, but because this is our lane we're swimming in, what role do you think it plays there?
I mean, there's
clearly, or hope it plays, maybe.
I mean, there's a basic news information thing. I think that's sort of like table stakes.
Table stakes, but important, right?
Important. I mean, I think one of the things, actually one of our comparative advantages over, I think, some other folks was actually daily newspaper experience and just doing it daily. We went 5 days a week. I actually was resisting. I was like, can we really keep this up? Because it's
it's a lot.
And I was like, I got out of the daily newspaper business. Why am I going back into it?
Right, but it's crucial because the world moves that quickly.
The world moves that quickly, and then you become trusted and a sort of habit that people rely on every morning. And it's a whole different relationship than just tossing something out every so often.
You're never behind.
Yeah.
Right.
And you can always do it again. So I love daily for that reason. There's a lot of reasons I don't like daily.
It disappears quickly. There's always tomorrow.
No, it's most like you have to do it every day. But the advantage of daily is you always get another bite at the apple. You can always update the story, and also the drumbeat becomes a thing. So there's that. There's an accountability function, right? And I do think and people, there's obviously investigations that have to happen, and that sort of scrutiny. But there's another thing, which is you want to be the sort of holder of the best aspirations of the community, right? So like any given deal might blow up, or like I don't know. We were very keen on a barrage back in the day, because the Arik Nakvi, who talked a very good game. It turned out he was like commingling funds and went down in a spectacular fraud. So any given thing can blow up, but the community as a whole kind of has a sort of North Star around impact. And so if you can sort of hold that space, then you sort of let people kind of project to it. So it's accountability both on the negative side, but also sort of like accountability to what your aspirations are in a sense.
Yeah.
And then that leads to the thing that I think we actually have arrived at, which is this kind of identity. And we've cooked up this idea of like agents of impact, of which you all are, because we got tired of saying investors and entrepreneurs, or equity and debt investors, or all the sort of laundry list of things you'd have to say to be inclusive, as well as intermediaries and policymakers, and we just said agents of impact, and everybody was kind of arriving at their purpose or their mission from wherever they sit, whatever kind of constraints they had, whatever kind of money they had. But they all were, it let us sort of get away from some of these disputes about like the right way to do this, and you can't be concessionary. You have to, you can only, you can't be, you can't. So we just said, okay, everybody's going to kind of come at this kind of common feeling that there's a way to use finance to optimize for social environmental benefits, and if we can kind of stitch all that together in an identity, they will then see like, oh, I'm in housing. I don't necessarily know that much about sustainable forestry, but I want to know just enough about it to know that there's people that are doing in sustainable forestry what I'm doing in affordable housing in some way. And so we created this kind of commonality around impact that cuts across asset classes and geographies and sectors and everything, and lets people say, oh, I'm part of that thing, which, and you guys are absolutely building that kind of ecosystem as well.
Right.
So I went from sort of like, just being an information provider, which is kind of the, the low level, to then we're kind of like somehow like kind of a convener, holder of this identity, and let people project. This is where you really get a kind of, from a business point of view, you get a kind of stickiness, right? People project their own aspirations onto you.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with you. They see themselves reflected back, and they say, oh, I like those guys because they reflect back to me what I think about myself.
Right.
And especially if you're in kind of a, you've been marginalized, or you're out in left field, or nobody listened to you for years, but
Right.
like, oh, there are
But
some
you're
other
like,
people that get me,
this.
you know?
Yeah. I love the way you layered that. You talked about information and then accountability and then holding our aspirations, and then above that, this like formation of identity. And I think that paints such a beautiful picture of, and an aspirational picture of what media can be. I'm not sure we're seeing that in many places at the moment across media, but it really paints a beautiful picture. And I think that last stage where you're able to bring together a diverse group of people who have disagreements, who don't all believe exactly the same things, but you bring some sense of unity, feels like such an important role in today's world. In our conversation downstairs, Jim said, in a world of tumult, I wrote it down, in a world of tumult and discord, we can build a better world. And I think that's what you find in that space at the top.
Yeah, and it lets you, and again, to the point of tumult and discord, if everybody says, okay, our North Star is positive impact, some of the discord kind of starts to fall away, theoretically. We'll see.
The devil's in the details on that one. That makes sense. You have been reporting on impact investing for over a decade, starting back in your Wall Street Journal times, maybe before that. Maybe it's always been something you've been interested in.
By different names.
By different names.
Different ways, yeah.
I'm curious how you would talk about the evolution of the field. How would you describe it? How has it changed in the last decade or longer?
People, generally speaking, know what you're talking about now, which was not the case. Was not at all.
That's helpful. That's helpful. Yep.
I think the field has gotten to the point where, like I said, these sort of doctrinal strategic disputes have kind of worked themselves out, like to more or less what I said. People are going to, there's this kind of spectrum, and people are going to do what they can do in their lane.
Yep.
And that, I think, has kind of lowered some of the temperature around the one right way to do things.
Yeah.
Every major financial institution has to have at least a team, if not a set of products and a strategy, or they've been left behind. So there's now people in every institution. We used to have a saying of infect the host. It kind of fell by the wayside in the pandemic days because it sounded wrong.
People didn't love that terminology.
People didn't love that, but originally it was like there's all these people inside, sort of fighting their own internal battles. And that's where we actually found one of our big value props was there were these teams. 6 people or 12 people in the sustainable finance group, in a C, and they needed validation for themselves, but they also needed to show their peers that, there's a real thing here.
Right.
And as they did, and then as folks like Jim Sorenson demanded that there be an impact platform at a big, wirehouse kind of bank, they said, we've had a lot of stories where somebody's like, they got plucked out. Like, you've been jawboning about this for years. Now go build something for us, right? So there's a way in which it's become kind of required in mainstream finance. And then, like I say, the themes of it, even if you don't call it impact investing, become more important. The last part of it, I'll say, is we concocted the name for ourselves, Impact Alpha, partly to give it a little, it was sort of a marketing thing. Like,
it's pithy,
what are people looking for? They're looking for alpha.
Yeah,
so
always.
So give them some impact alpha.
Yeah.
And that has been, we had to back off. We don't think every impact investing delivers financial alpha. We say you can take your alpha in either financial returns or in impact. You can outperform on impact, and that's your choice. It's your money. You can choose what kind of returns you want. But the notion that there's a set of ideas or levers that can be deployed to outperform, and that they kind of sort around, broader distribution of wealth, more, bigger pie, untapped talent, untapped markets, there's a kind of thing and those ideas are now kind of more accepted and mainstream, and so that's to our mutual point that this becomes kind of a broader kind of not just investment, but also policy
Broader
and
movement.
a way to sort of organize the economy.
Yeah. May it be so. I love that. The Gin just released new numbers for the field last year in their kind of annual report as being a $1.5 trillion global market. That's a really big number. I said it to someone the other day and they said, that's nonsense.
You know why? Because they read our story, which I put out time, which the Gin did not like, where I said 1.5 trillion-ish. Because
I like the qualification. Ish is a good word. Is a good term.
Well, because there's a bunch of qualifications. For starters, the Gin used to literally survey and tabulate, right?
Yep.
And then they realized, maybe we're not getting everybody. So they started sort of fudging it up a little bit,
Sure.
right? Like, and then like they sort of gave it some multiplier number, and it's like, well, if you didn't reach them, how did you know who they are? Well, we sort of estimated, and then they had, so there were various ways in which that number is just sort of a projection, and the Gin, bless it, its heart, always, it always wanted to have sort of be.
It's marching upward.
It wanted to be, more than 1.5 trillion as opposed to nearly 1.5 trillion. So it was.
They're in marketing too. They're in marketing too.
It was 1.571 or something. It wasn't 1.486 or something,
Yeah,
right? So that was one thing, and then the other part of it is they. And I think we agree, but they've made a big push in the last few years to include public markets impact. And speaking of doctrinal disputes, can you get impact in the public markets? Let's just say you can, but much of the growth has come in public market commitments, big institutional commitments to public markets impact strategies. So, but then when people think of impact, they mostly think of private markets. So I think there needs to be a little more granular kind of disaggregation of those numbers to really understand what's going on. But it's a big number and it's growing.
It's a big number.
We said directionally it's fine.
It's directionally fine. It's a big number and it's growing. And I think you hit on probably where one of, at least in my experience, one of the biggest points of contention in the current industry is, can you get impact in the public markets? I think there are very well-respected people in our industry who are just straight out saying, no, you cannot. And to get great impact, you must only be in the private markets, and would advise that. And so I think
additionality is the big question. And I think that people used to say, oh no, don't make me prove additionality. It's just enough that I'm doing the right thing, right?
Right.
But now I think people are getting around to like, well, where can you act? That you should have. You shouldn't just be generic fungible money. And it can be done in, your shareholder advocacy, or and I think public markets themselves are very distinct. There's obviously the Magnificent Seven or something, but there's a lot of new companies that have just IPO'd or are listed on some of our friends are listing very early stage companies on a stock market in Mauritius because they can get access to cheaper capital in the public markets. So I think just saying public is not, also has to be disaggregated.
Right. Interesting. What do you think so the number, regardless of how fudgy it is and how ish it is big and not big enough? What takes us from here to like the next, do we just fudge our way to 3 trillion, or, what takes us from here to the next big change, the next big step change? Predict the future for us, David.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of a theory of change question, and I will say my theory of change has been a little bit rattled, and not just by sort of recent events, but by this notion that impact investing was supposed to say basically you could make measurable and demonstrative, tangible, positive difference, and that you could do that. And Jim is a great spokesperson for this. You can do that in a way that attracts enough capital to be able to scale and make it even bigger.
Yeah.
And I think, in our estimation that, enough of these models actually have been proven out, but yet they haven't kind of gone through that. Right.
Massive scale change.
So the, I don't know, cognitive bias or roadblocks in the markets are sort of more stubborn than I would have guessed. I thought I had kind of came out of it, as you said, from a kind of tech reporting kind of milieu, and I kind of put impact in the kind of in a kind of tech, exponential growth kind of framework, and it's a little kludgier than that. And so now you layer on disinformation and a whole bunch of other sort of things, and it gets even fuzzier. But I do think that the risks are real, and the opportunities are real, and in the long enough term, the risks will play out, and people will come back around to the solutions and the kinds of approaches that mitigate those risks by being more, by reducing wealth inequality, by tackling climate change. Those are major systemic things that the whole economy is going to have to deal with
at some point,
regardless of what you or I do. It's just that's just out there. And so then our thought now is that the kinds of models that have been developed will in a kind of disruptive innovation kind of way, that they start out at the fringes and the margins, and then either something collapses over here or something goes
and suddenly you're left standing,
or there's a huge there's a to just pick an example, a Tesla that changes the the car industry, some innovation that used to be at the fringes becomes the new solution, and I think impact kind of is that, and I just don't know quite when the actual, like the 1.5 is still more like this. It's not quite like that.
I have a hard time figuring out how I want to ask the next question, but maybe I'll jump from there into, because I think I heard you say, there's a couple things that are going on that are keeping us from that liftoff moment, and one of them is like some cognitive bias in the market. One of them is, I heard you say maybe potentially not lifting our eyes to the horizon on some existential risks that are kind of out there, but maybe people don't feel like they're close enough to have to act. And we're starting to see companies act on some of them. I would say in the food system space, you're seeing actually a lot of action on the climate change side, because food companies that don't necessarily care about climate change are recognizing their supply chain is going to be disrupted massively. And so they need, that risk has become medium term. And so they're making really significant changes. Not motivated by impact, but motivated by preservation and risk. So I heard you kind of say that, right? Like we need some of these, unfortunately, we need some of the risks maybe to come into focus a little clearer for folks. Does that?
Yeah. And actually to your point, this 1.5 trillion, I think, like in climate, I know vast majority of the spending, it has nothing to do with funds and investments and ventures and startups. It's corporate spending on the supply chain, just like you say. And it doesn't show up in a fund total at all. It's procurement. It's and that I think has shifted for all those reasons. Which is why a lot of these companies, they might have to twist a little bit in the wind now or shift a little bit in the wind. But they're all going to be doing just what you say. They're all trying to save money on their on their water bill or something.
Exactly, trying to save money on their water bill, trying to make sure they can procure the things they need next year and 5 years from now that they're going to need.
And they want that. Costco came out and said we need the talent. We need diverse talent. It's not some overhead cost. It's actually the way we run our business. Diverse customers, diverse employees.
That leads us a little bit, I think, into today's environment. And I'd be curious to hear your perspective on the policy environment today, because I would put that as maybe the last block on, you've got risk that needs to come a little bit closer. You've got some cognitive bias in the markets. You've maybe got some public perception problems. But the last block of that would be, are there policy things that in today's environment you see as real opportunities to coalesce around that will help usher capital into the impact space?
Well, I mean, again, this is like a thing we've had to wrestle with, just in the current environment, as I keep saying, as a euphemism. What are the lanes in which impact investors can be productive, and then where we can be helpful, to that world. And there are things that I think are, we're reminded, and I think Sorenson folks have been very involved early on with opportunity zones, for example. And there's a sort of opportunity zones 2.0 kind of legislation working its way through. And again, that was something where, I think it got some bad press at some point for, abuses or sort of examples that could be held up, but there are a ton of good
Success
outcomes
stories.
out of that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And it was a very interesting kind of way of kind of tweaking a few levers and bringing capital into,
right.
and you know, it can be improved in terms of the measurement and the impact and whatnot, but
sure,
those kinds of
yeah,
things.
Was an interesting policy example of driving capital into impactful projects.
We think this sort of ownership economy, or ownership investing, as people are starting
Yep.
to call it, has all the hallmarks of a, you know, not even just bipartisan, but just like a common sense kind of. It's one of these things where a light bulb goes off, like, oh, there's all these business owners that want to retire because they're getting to be older boomers, and they could either sell out to the private equity company, it's probably going to cut all their employees. They could sell out to their competitor, who they hated all those years, or they could sell to their own employees.
Right.
And their own, and you can, and as long as you could finance it over, you know, time and pay it back from the business, those employees could, you know, get a leg up and a stake in the economy. You know, the business could continue to exist and do the goods and services to the community that it's been doing.
Yeah.
And
the owner gets to exit.
And so there's kind of a, it's kind of one of those things. It's like, oh, there's a kind of, you know, bigger pie, you know, expanding prosperity kind of model that actually works for investors, for employees, for the old business owner. And, you know, who could actually be against that?
Right, right.
And it really takes is like a few policy tweaks, a few kind of new financial products, ability to sort of underwrite kind of things that used to be considered kind of funky and complicated, but now can be modeled in various ways. And so I think there's plenty for folks to do, you know, even in this world, and I think it would be a real mistake for people to think like, you know, everything is stalled now.
Yeah, I love that example. I was recently in New York and had a conversation with a foundation where the funds from that foundation actually came from the sale of the Welch's company, and they sold to their employees and to their co-op farmers. So the farmers, the cooperative farmers, own the company now, but the owner still got large enough exit. They've got a pretty sizable foundation today, right? And so the owner gets to exit. The employees now have this ownership. The brand, that brand has grown massively. So I imagine that's been a very good deal for the employees of the company and the co-op farmers. Such a beautiful example that doesn't happen often enough, and kind of gets ignored in today's world.
And just to the ecosystem point, so we talked about sort of the impact identity, but even in these sort of categories like ownership or whatnot, those are sort of identity kinds of things. And so we're trying, and Sorenson folks are involved with this as well, to create this kind of identity around, oh, I'm an ownership investor. And you can be an ownership investor, like you said, in the grape juice business, in any kind of business. That if you, and it's not just employee ownership, but it's also home ownership and community ownership. We just did a story on a strip mall in Portland that is owned by got bought by a community investment trust, and then over time they sell it to the neighborhoods.
Yeah, cool.
And the neighbors over, I think, you know, a number of years have put in $300,000 or $400,000, and then they can sell their stakes back, and they've used it to start businesses or buy their own home or something. So all these things that are kind of wealth building structures, you know, that ride up on the sort of, you know, rising prosperity, you know, are perfect kind of impact investing opportunities. Yeah,
that's super interesting. And in this whole conversation, one of the topics that's interesting to me in this time, you kind of said, we have to find what are our lanes right now, right? Where can we swim? Where can we get real work done, even if the world feels a little tumultuous? I'm curious about your thoughts on language, because there are words in today's environment that have become third rails, right? They're instantly polarizing. And I'm curious how you see kind of like the impact investing industry. And at the moment, impact in and of itself has not come under fire as a word in quite the same way that DEI or ESG or, you know, some other things have really come under fire. I'm just curious on that topic, like what do you think of language? Where do you see kind of opportunities for us and how we talk about the work that we do to be, for lack of a better word, maybe like inclusive, to draw people together, to help make sure that people find themselves in it, no matter where they sit on the political spectrum?
Yeah. I mean, just something like there was some polling done, I think, and DEI, you know, has been fully weaponized and polls very poorly. But if you take it out of that and you actually ask about diversity, you know, equity and inclusion, actually
by themselves
are all extremely
very popular.
Have massive public support.
Yeah.
Diversity sometimes triggers, people think quotas or something like that. So that's the one thing there. But inclusion, actually, which you just used again, people are all in favor of that.
Right.
And we've had this kind of notion that like the kinds of things and the kinds of investments that you'd make in a kind of urban, and maybe black milieu, about economic, empowerment, economic mobility, are not that different from the kinds of investments you'd make in a rural, getting a farm business going, or an ag tech business. It's access to capital, it's entrepreneurial training, it's markets, it's all the kinds of ecosystem supports. That there's more like. We were talking about this just, the nation has never been more divided. It's like kind of like actually it's starting to sort of sort out like what kinds of things actually work. Now, we're in a moment where a lot of kind of, systems or programs, put it that way, budget line items are getting cut. So there's going to be a lot of rebuilding to do. And let's make sure that, as that goes on, that, folks are keeping impact as the North Star, and I think there could be a lot of improvements. We just had a story this morning, I think, in the brief about kind of the second order implications of like the USAID cutbacks, right?
Yeah.
So at the first order,
massive loss of jobs.
Loss of jobs, loss of great programs, people, HIV treatment stopped, all of which is, uncontestably, has very real world, effects on people's lives. But if you were designing a resilient financing ecosystem for meeting basic needs, for example, in Africa, you might actually not design it to have like USAID making those decisions. You might have a lot more, African local capital providers and locals and whatnot. So you wouldn't necessarily have chosen to like decimate USAID, but if they're going to build back something better, there's some different
Could there be opportunities? In this moment. That's an interesting one. It's difficult to talk about that in this moment, and I think it's actually really important, right? We've got to get out in front and talk about where we're headed.
It is difficult because you don't want to, retroactively, bless the destruction and whatnot. And I do think that you have to, pick your battles. That's what, talk about lanes, pick your battles. One thing we've been tracking is, and people probably know, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, right? And this was going to set up a nationwide system of like community development financial institutions that were going to lend for, for green infrastructure projects in particularly low-income communities, and it was going to leave behind this whole lending infrastructure. And we were like, thought that was like spot, totally in our sweet spot, right? And and it was a biggest chunk of money ever to be deployed that way and whatnot. And one of the things that the previous administration did was park that $20 billion in a financial agent account at Citibank for precisely the thing.
This reason.
Precisely this reason. And so now they're trying to claw that back from a private bank where it's already been allocated. So. Citibank is in a interesting position.
Position.
Because they're like a bank. They're supposed to represent their customers and safeguard that money. That's what banks do, right? There's you could have different opinions, policy opinions on that, but you could also say, well, maybe somebody actually designed this in a way that might actually have persist and
make it resilient.
And maybe we will get a nationwide green lending infrastructure.
Maybe we will. Maybe we will. I think that's one of the words that I've loved, and I think actually does have a bit of like nonpartisan sound to it through this transition, has been resilience and building for resilience. And I think in the impact investing industry, that's a word that it would do us well to really focus on. How do we build the systems that we're building and the funding that we're building for resilience to change? No matter who's in the administration, does this still work? No matter who controls the narrative, does this still work? No matter if this acronym or that acronym disappears or becomes a third rail, does my strategy still work? But building for that resilience. I think it's crucial.
And there's an interesting sort of angle to that, which is that private capital actually has, it may in fact turn out to be more resilient in this, because and things that are not necessarily reliant on public policy. Like a lot of the climate tech or climate investments would always say, a year or so ago, oh, we love the subsidies, we love the incentives, but we built our business to work regardless. And,
yeah.
And we'll
find out now.
We're like, we'll find out now.
Whether that's really true,
But at least the early indications are that, there's sort of a,
yeah.
I mean, I think some deals will blow up.
Sure.
It'll wash out some things that got maybe,
overinflated
into kind of a bubble. But the solar is the cheapest, form of energy, new form of energy. Most of the new generating capacity is renewables. That's not because of IRA or anything.
Right.
It's because
or ideology, right?
It's because
it's dollars and cents.
Yeah. Now you can accelerate these things,
Right.
you can slow them down, et cetera.
Right.
But there are some trends that are going to stick with us.
Yeah. As you can see, David and I could do this all day. If you guys disappeared, we would actually just keep volleying back and forth and talking about the industry.
We're going to go on the road and start a talk show.
I know, we are. Yeah, we're starting a talk show. This is the first episode. Just wait. I'm going to turn it to the crowd for a couple questions in a few minutes. We'll close out shortly, but I'm going to give David one last question so that you all have a moment to think about what you might want to hear him talk about. I'm curious, this has woven its way through our whole conversation and weaves its way through every time you and I talk. Is what do you think some indicators are now and will be down the road that impact investing is going mainstream, is actually accomplishing what we want it to? Like, what should we be looking for? What do we know? How do we know if we're doing it?
I think there'll be like a little bit of a vibe shift, and people won't be as sort of sheepish about it, and it'll come out of this, like I said, out of this kind of patronizing pat on the head form into and you'll feel a little bit more sort of public leadership from business leaders and political leaders.
Yep, they'll feel more grown up.
Yeah, and they may not use the words impact investing, but they'll say, we're building this, this model where it's going to not only be sustainable, but it's going to scale and grow, and we're going to deliver better quality jobs and better livelihoods and shared prosperity for all, and they're going to say that as a hard-nosed business proposition, not as a philanthropic charity kind of thing. And that there'll be a kind of popular constituency behind that, which I think was maybe one of the, has been one of the things that I think the impact investing world may have, and maybe us as well, may have let slide in a certain way. That there was, to the extent it was seen as like a investment strategy or a wealth management strategy that didn't exactly cry out like populist fervor, right? Right. So, but even though many of those investments were actually built on making people
everyday lives,
making everyday lives better, but it was sort of seen as a financial tool, not as a popular sort of.
Right.
So there'll be leadership, and there'll also be a sort of popular base, and it'll almost be kind of common sense. Like why wouldn't you? Right. If you can make people's lives better, and you can make money at it, and that's and that saves government money, and like there's the common sense sort of thing will start to emerge. I was trying to think whether there'll be like a particular moment. Actually, a few years ago, there was Chris Jurgens at the Omidyar Network, some of you may know, did a sort of thing looking backwards, and he said, the FT will pronounce that impact investing has grown to a $100 trillion business, and he said, by I think 2050 or something. And then he said, and he looked at me in the audience, he said, and of course the Impact Alpha bought the FT.
Oh, there we go. That's the real indicator. Impact Alpha bought the Financial Times. You heard the prediction first at Omidyar and then here. That's when we know we made it.
There
right?
You go.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited about the returns that will come to the investors of Impact Alpha when we hit that moment. Well, you're doing it. Congratulations. You're doing as an entrepreneur, you're doing as an editor, and I applaud you in particular, having been an entrepreneur, for knowing when the time is to pick lanes too and let someone else take on the CEO role, or maybe gratefully give up the things you were having to do in that space. But thanks for coming out to share with all of us.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much.